I've heard that the Catholic young people are moving in similar ways as young people from other congregations and denominations to becoming nuns, N-O-N-E. I'm wondering if you think that is generally true, and what's accounting for that? What do you think? What crossed my mind is, are there fewer young people going to parochial schools, or just what are the influences that might be contributing to that?
It's a great question. We were just talking about this in the context of students coming to Goshen College last week, as we have looked at some demographic data of our incoming class this year and realized, well, there's a lower percentage of Mennonite students, but then when you start to look down the list, you quickly get to the nuns. So we really don't know how many of those students may have been brought up Mennonite and just are not reporting. But I do think the national trends from what I've read, at least within a higher education context, is they just don't want to disclose. They're at an exploratory point in their life. They're not necessarily wanting to say what faith tradition they have because they may be questioning, uncertain about what direction their life will take. So I think it's just kind of a demographic thing of this age group that they have not really affiliated. And that doesn't mean that they don't go to church every Sunday and they aren't active in a congregation or a parish. They just don't want to tell you, which is very odd for this group that lives their life on social media. And privacy doesn't seem to be a very big deal because they're very quick to tell you what they had for breakfast that morning or what color socks they're wearing, but they don't want to tell you where they go to church. I don't know how we break all that down yet, but it is, I think, a trend we're seeing kind of across the board.
Ken, on the schedule here, you're also listed under this same topic of adjustments, marriage.
Sure, I'll take a minute just to comment on that, since we didn't, I want to give Richard and Judy their time. Oh, sure. The question is that I was also on the agenda here to talk about adjustments in marriage. My wife, Tiffany, was not able to join us. She has recently started a job at Chandler Elementary School, so she is probably just wrapping up her school day right about now. But she is not Mennonite either. She came from a Southern Baptist faith tradition, so I married a Baptist, so we had our own transitions, I guess you could say. Not all that different, I think, from what Richard and Judy reflected, although there were some other elements. I was a Northerner, I married a Southerner, so there's that whole Mason-Dixon line that sort of gets in the way sometimes. We were married in a Catholic church, but not during a Catholic Mass. I mentioned our lifelong friend of our family, Father George. He agreed to marry us, even though that was somewhat uncharacteristic, especially for kind of an older priest, and especially in a Catholic church, to marry a Catholic and a non-Catholic. It was about a year or two after we got married that Tiffany decided to join the Catholic Church and went through the RCIA program in Harrisonburg, where we were living at the time, and has become a member of the Catholic Church. We are raising our children Catholic, so both my daughters have been baptized in the Catholic Church. Our older daughter has received her first communion. Our younger daughter, Corinne, will do that next year as she's in first grade now, and that typically happens in the second grade year. So our children are involved in the church. Something that has happened recently that I really never thought I'd see in my lifetime is that young girls are now able to be altar servers. So my father was an altar server, I was an altar server, and now my older daughter, Cameron, is an altar server, which, as the father of two daughters, I wasn't sure I'd ever get to say that. So, she can now participate in the Mass in a way that really was not an option growing up for my sister, to be part of the Mass in that way. So that's a little bit about my family and kind of our relationship in the church. But, we went through very similar situations, I think, in kind of planning a wedding and executing a wedding. If you think Mennonites don't like to drink, talk to a Southern Baptist because they really don't want to talk about alcohol. My wife's family did give us some money for the wedding, but were quite clear that they were not going to purchase alcohol, and if there was going to be alcohol at the wedding, it was on us. As a Catholic, and I often joke that, Catholics have mixed alcohol and religion beautifully for centuries, so there must be alcohol. I have a Irish Catholic grandmother who insisted that there must be something to imbibe that afternoon, because there was dancing. There was never a question about the dancing so much as there was about the alcohol, but we got through that. But all in all, it has worked out, and I think, as Judy said, often you kind of have to find a median, and one moves closer to the other. And for, I think, a lot of reasons, and I don't want to speak for Tiffany, but she sort of had some questioning of a very traditional background, a very conservative background growing up in a traditional conservative Southern Baptist church that she just sort of spiritually moved away from and didn't really agree with a lot of the roles of women in her church growing up, and also kind of, I think, just some philosophical differences, and kind of gravitated to the parish that we belonged to. Like I said, we were kind of floating back and forth between a parish in Harrisonburg, but also with the Catholic campus ministry that was very young and vibrant and kind of celebrated things a little bit differently, and that was kind of what kind of won her over and kind of shaped a little bit of moving to Catholicism.
I have a question, wondering if sometimes politics doesn't really drive us more than religion. Thinking about liberation theology, in a sense, I thought that Pope John Paul helped liberate a lot of people in Poland and places like that. Is that not a form of liberation theology?
I think I would agree with that, and that stemmed from his strong opposition to communism. But I would argue that when it came to Latin America, he was less interested in that because he felt there were communist forces behind what was happening in Nicaragua and those other countries. I would agree, though, with the general view that politics does drive a lot of what happens with churches. I think, despite what church leaders will want. I mean, and you could see it playing out with Pope Francis. I mean, when he talks about climate change, and some of the issues with capitalism, Obama and the Democrats are very happy when the Pope talks about abortion and issues related to that. I mean, Republicans stand up and cheer. And I will not deny that when I was a practicing Catholic and the Pope said certain things I disagreed with, I disagreed with them. Just like there are people now who very much disagree with Francis on some of the issues.
I would agree with some of Richard's comments. I think, back to John Paul II, the liberation theology piece was big for parts of the world. I've talked a little bit about being exposed to a Maryknoll tradition and a lot of global service, and a lot of what the Maryknolls were doing were liberation theology in other parts of the world. So I think it's been part of the tradition. It's just how deeply it runs through, I guess, that political vein as well. So that's where the Catholic Church has gotten themselves in trouble in other parts of the world, is getting a little too involved in politics. But I think this Pope and the Jesuit background of Francis is opening up a lot of questions on equity and equality around the world, shining a light on poverty and helping those in need, which I think a lot of governments have to really look themselves in the mirror and see how are we helping those in our countries that are less advantaged than others, but also globally what that means as a faith and following the word of Jesus to help the poor.
I've recently heard that there's been some changes in Colombia, some peace agreements have been taking 50 years to get to that point. What has the Catholic Church done to impact what's happening in Colombia?
I was going to say, I really have not followed that closely, so I don't want to kind of project. I really couldn't answer you on that one.
My name is Angel Miranda. When I was in college, I went by my middle name, Louis. I'm usually hesitant of speaking English, even though I study university in the States. But I hope you understand my accent, my Spanish accent from out in the country in Puerto Rico. When I became a Mennonite, I went through all the ceremonies of the Catholic Church: baptism, infant baptism, confirmation. I took catechism, and all of that. Then, when the Mennonites came to Puerto Rico, I felt that they brought something different. And there was conflict actually within the Catholic Church and the mission of the Protestant churches in our island. So sometimes the communication between the Catholic and the other Christians was kind of poor. But I live not too far from where two priests lived in Puerto Rico. Now, for the time, I almost turned completely against the practices, the doctrines, and the things in the Catholic Church. But you know what happened at this time? I come also from a mixed marriage. My wife has a last name Esh. Came down for VS in Puerto Rico. We got married. And, her family is not a Mennonite anymore, but I kept being a Mennonite. The situation is that at this point, our youngest son, he got a BA in music from Goshen College not too long ago. And do you know what he does on Sunday? Maybe, he has some photo that he knows about him, yeah, Bob. There's a church in the Loop in Chicago, St. Spirit Church, and he's the cantor of that church. Sometimes he sings about 3 or 4 times every weekend in that church. So that, in a way, has helped me to see the church from other perspective, because now I see our youngest son, he has a ministry. The last time we were in Chicago, my wife and I was surprised that he was the one that began the whole event of the Mass by leading the singing and so on. So yes, we have to give thanks for what is happening.
Thank you. Thank you again. I'll turn it over to Glenn.